Okay, so welcome everyone to this conversation about the new important book. Thank you, Alec, for devoting years of your life to making this book happen.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure. It really was.
Yeah, about Buckminster Fuller. And thank you, Bonnie, for joining us to have your conversation with Alec, who helped with the book. I am admitting a couple more people from the waiting room here. I just want to mention before we begin officially that my name is Felicia Chavez, and I've been with the Buckminster Fuller Institute for somewhat less than a year now. It'll be a year in October. And I want to mention that make sure to please keep your lines on mute if you are not currently speaking. And we will be having a follow-up event on September 12th with Alec and Lionel Wohlberger to have a Q&A, a more extensive Q&A on September 12th. And members, you can use the same membership registration code that we gave you for this event. And I will put my email in the chat as well. And I wanted to mention, we also have a few spots available for the Stanford Archives visit live and in person on August 26th. So my email will be in this message that I'm putting in the chat. And let's see, if you're not currently a member of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, here is the link in the chat to join. And then finally, as Bonnie and Alec get going, I'll put some links to some reviews of Alec's book in the chat box. And then at the very end of the program, we have an experimental community platform called a Welo, and I'll put that link at the end of the program so that if you want to have a chat with other BFI members or visitors today, then you're welcome to come into the Welo and hang out with people. And I think, let's see, I turn now to Bonnie, longtime BFI helper, and Alec. And yeah, and I know, Alec, you wanted to just say hi, but hand it off to the two of you now. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Felicia, and thanks to the BFI. The Institute's support for this book has been really gratifying, and I'm really grateful for the push that you've given it. Because yeah, so today is the official release date. This is kind of my unofficial launch event for Inventor of the Future, the visionary life of Buckminster Fuller, which, as Felicia mentioned, this has been a book that I've been working on for, I would say, 3.5 years. Close to 4 at this point. So it's kind of surreal and very exciting to see it out and available for people to read at last. So when I first started the book, one of the first things I did was email BFI to see what resources they had and what advice they could give me. And I would say the first thing they said was contact Bonnie. Bonnie, I would say, knows the Fuller archives as well as anyone possibly can. And her support from my very first visit to Stanford, all these years ago, has been crucial to this project. So I want to thank her now, and I'm delighted that she was able to join us for today's conversation. So there's a lot to talk about with Fuller, and I know that this group, I imagine, is a fairly well-informed one when it comes to the details of his life. So, there are many possible approaches. And the one I do want to talk about first is the archives. The Stanford collection of Fuller's papers, featuring the Demaxian Chronofile, is an incredible resource. And I want to kind of make sure that people understand what it is, how it works, how you can use it to, pursue your own projects. And I thought the best way to start off today was actually to ask Bonnie, could you tell us a bit about your history with the archives and what it was like when you were working there most actively?
Yeah, Alec, thank you for coming today. Congratulations. This is a real milestone for you after 3 intensive years of working on your biography, the first comprehensive biography of Buckminster Fuller that could have not been done any other time. The digital access, the way that you're able to acquire so many materials is fascinating. I know this because I have a 40-year history with Bucky, and I've been working with the archives since 1989 in two manifestations. And so Alec and I basically have about a 35-year span between when I encountered the archives after reading everything Bucky wrote. I guess you could call me an acolyte at that time, but I was in grad school. I thought that maybe Buckminster Fuller would have a closet, or Allegro would have a closet of his materials. Little did I know, when I knocked on the door, there was a BFI, and I knocked on the door, there was a card in front, tiny card saying Buckminster Fuller Institute. When I got to the archives, you couldn't really tell what was the archives and what was the institute. And I knew right from the start that it needed more care. It needed to find an institutional supportive environment. So, and I did have a lot of background already in, and not only in Bucky's work, but also with archives management and with documentation. So my experience with the archives was one of literally like almost opening up a gift from the past, into the future. And I believe that we're passing batons over to the next generation. So I feel like it was such a great privilege to actually be asked by Alec at the very beginning of his project to start giving him a sense of the shape and of the environment. The archive I came to was ordered in the same way Bucky ordered it. And he was a very unique person in the sense that his archives was considered by Nicholas Olsberg of the Smithsonian in one of the first overviews of the archives in 1985 as the most extensive personal archives in existence. And I believe it's absolutely true because we live in a digital age, and what he did was all on paper. The chronophile, which all of you already know about Bucky's life. This is what's so fun about speaking to all of you. A lot of you don't know about the guinea pig bee experiment. So what Alec and I actually encountered in two different manifestations was the results of what I think is Bucky's greatest artifact that he never got to see in the shape that it finally was in. I got to see it as a whole, and now it's separated into boxes in the university style. And I've been working with it for 20 years since it's been in Stanford. So I do know the two different environments of it, and all of the finding aids that Bucky himself created that then Stanford was able to digitize as the finding aid that is available to all of you now. So Alec, my experience really was with the archive in a small space. When we moved it to Santa Barbara, when I organized the move, we weighed the whole thing and it was 90,000 pounds or 45 tons. And Bucky was all about how much does it weigh? And this was something he carted around with him all over the place. While he was doing all of the work that he did, he was keeping very close to that lifetime experiment, and everybody worked with him to do that. His family, his friends, his students, his colleagues. So that was the archive I knew. And I'd like to know a little bit about what your encounter was and what surprised you the most when you actually came to this archives that was far bigger than probably anybody could imagine until you see it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is important to me because I think a lot of people don't even realize what this archive is or what it's like to use it. And I kind of want to go through my experience just kind of in a very step-by-step way to encourage people who are curious about Fuller or about the history of design or a lot of subjects, to just go to Stanford and check out this stuff for yourself. So if you go online to the Stanford Library's website, you can download the finding aid. which is this 1,000-page PDF document. It's searchable. It's very well organized. It doesn't cover everything, but it's definitely a great starting point. If you want to like figure out what boxes are useful, because they list the names of correspondence, people mentioned, in the correspondence or in his papers, projects, images, all that stuff. So, that's the obvious starting point. Once you've got the finding aid and you have a sense of what you want to look at, you can go to their online request system, which is very intuitive. It's easy to use, and you can request, I believe it's 5 boxes per day, I think. Maybe they'll waive that limit occasionally for people like me who, like ask because you're only in town for a week and you have to go through 50 boxes of stuff. But you can place your request via the online system, and then within a day or two, usually those boxes are transferred from the offsite storage facility to the reading room at Green Library, Stanford. So my experience, which was pre-pandemic, I should say, things may have changed in the years since then, is that you arrive at the library, you get a visitor's pass, you go to the reading room for special collections, you check your bag, you can bring in a laptop and a pencil and some other things. But then you go to the desk there, and if you've placed your request in advance, they will have your boxes ready to go, and they'll give you one at a time, and you can take it to a table to examine the contents. All right. So what do you see? And this to me was like kind of unclear, because I didn't really know, even from like the descriptions of the Chronofile, especially, that I'd seen elsewhere, like what's it like to look at this stuff. So there I mean, in my mind, there are several distinct stages in the Chronofile. Okay, the first stage is essentially what I see as like a huge scrapbook. Fuller kept all kinds of ephemera from his life, starting from when he was a child. So you go back and you see, letters he wrote to his parents when he was in grade school. You see his, correspondence with his wife, Anne. You see letters from relatives. You see his dry cleaning bills. You see his hotel receipts. You see all kinds of stuff, right? And for the first, up until I would say the late 30s, he had it bound in these like huge volumes, they're about like maybe like this thick, and they're fragile, they're fading, the pages have yellowed. You have to be very careful, like turning, these pages. And it's kind of like very haphazard. Like, he would glue in letters still in their original envelopes in many cases. And so you have to be very careful about removing them and unfolding them. And it's all there, right? Like I have not gone through the entire Chronofile, obviously. I don't think any human being can, but I was very insistent that I at least try to go through every volume up until Fuller was in his early 20s, because it had never really been, looked at in its entirety before, at least not by a biographer. So I really had to like go through every page, and it was not possible for me to like do that physically at the library itself because I was only there for a short time. But as Bonnie points out, today we have cell phone cameras. We have ways to take scans of these pages very easily. And so I spent a week on my first visit doing that for 8 hours a day. Basically, it was pretty intense. And then I hired assistants to go in and do the rest for me. So I had a list of items I knew I wanted based mostly on the finding aid, and I would just deploy Stanford students. I had 4 or 5 probably working for me at various points to take images, convert them to PDF format, and just send me these files. And so we're talking like tens of thousands of pages of documents. The Chronofile evolves a bit as you go on. Starting after the scrapbook period, you see a lot of bound folders of documents. You see loose folders of documents. And again, it's still pretty disorganized. And I would say after Fuller acquired more staff members, the archivists become more systematic in terms of just, they really go almost like day by day. And so toward, I would say, the early 50s, the amount of material just explodes, and it gets bigger and bigger with every passing year because he saved everything. He saved random letters from people asking about the Damascus map. He saved just like crank letters. He saved, again, receipts. So in the early period, like one big scrapbook volume might cover a year of his life, let's say. Later on, we're talking like multiple boxes for each year, many of which contain, I would say the vast majority of it is like very routine correspondence, that his office was doing to arrange these talks he gave or other public appearances. And every now and then you find something amazing. And I maybe I'll like throw this to Bonnie in a second, but the biggest challenge for this, or among the challenges for writing this book, was how do you deal with the massive amount of information you have, and how do you narrow down your focus? How do you say, okay, I can't look at everything, but how do I identify the pieces I need, and where can I find them? That to me was the biggest challenge.
Yeah, well, I remember in our earliest conversations, just went back to all of our back and forth through that, especially the first year of you working on the book. And, what I experienced with the archive is there is what I called the mother lode sections. So there were the sketch series and, of course, the old chronophile. I was more interested in processing as much as I could, putting things in archives as free boxes. So a lot of the box materials from the early years I was able to process, but the interest was very big back at that time. I worked with museums and researchers and writers and filmmakers, and so it was easy to grab because I was in it, right inside, and I felt like I was in Bucky's mind. So I actually was quite privileged to have that, but I also had a big responsibility. It was still owned by the family, and I worked intensively with it for 6 years. So I did get to know a great deal of the archive before it even went to Stanford. So I think that when I found the earliest maps, I was just blown away. Why are they stuck in this really compressed fashion? And so we needed to get boxes to put the flat files in. And a lot of that processing had to be done during that time. But it has taken many, many years at Stanford to process, according to, as you say, Alec, that the university style, which is in these smaller archive boxes, and you can only order 5 at a time. So I kept on going. It's almost like Bucky allowed me, I don't know why me, I was just a single mom, putting myself through grad school after the university, and I got to see the whole first. Then I got to know the parts. And then I got to come back when it was at Stanford, and no longer did I have to hold this thing. I was able to be an independent researcher, a curator. I was able to work with different projects. So I do know where all the mother lodes are. You know far more. And I wanted to there's 2 quotes that I think are really important. First of all, I think the Chronofile really is an autobiography, a multi-volume autobiography that Bucky kept, but he didn't look at. So a lot of the stuff that he never talked about, the myth of Bucky, is actually dispelled. Your book does that because it's dispelled inside the archives itself. He kept everything. The good, the bad, you could see what he called mystique. And so I got to be an acolyte, but then I got to be a scholar. And I didn't have to, but I also didn't get the opportunity to be with it like that again, be inside of the thinking process of Bucky. And the way he ordered the archive is his artifact. It's his mind. The way that he organized it made it very easy for Stanford to process it, because everything was kept in volumes and then in sections, 20 different sections. So although you got to, see a lot from the many students that were taking photographs for you while you were on the other side of the country. Let's see. Anyway, when you were on the other side of the country, your book had the opportunity. It's only been 3 years since people can actually take photographs of what's in the archive. We couldn't do that for all the years that I was there, for all the years that it was being processed at Stanford. It only happened more recently. So that was a timing thing. And what Bucky said about the archive that is in his 4D time lock, he had, let me see. Oh, I have many notes for this, but what he said about the archive was number one, that he was an ordinary man living from the Newtonian age to the Einsteinian age, and he was a documentarian of the individual in the 20th century. So coming right along. So I want to hand it back to you, Alec, and ask you a few questions about some of the things that, well, particularly the things that maybe people who really love Bucky's work might be shocked. There's a lot of big surprises in your biography, and talk a little bit about that aspect of it, that the difference between the myth and the real story of the human being that Bucky was.
Yeah, and this is a big part of the book, because I want to make it very clear. I admire Fuller. I think he's a genius. He was a huge part of my life. But I think the version of himself that he presented to the world was, it was designed to accomplish his objectives. And it meant that he was telling a story that, was not always true when you go back and compare it to the actual sources, which he kept, as you say, it's all there. And it was really remarkable to go back and take some of these canonical Fuller stories that have been repeated in so many other books about him and compare them to what is actually in the archives. And you often find that the story is very different. So there are two examples that I like to talk about. One is the Demaxian car. And I just published a piece in Slate this morning that kind of compares the stock standard Fuller account, which is that the car was discredited because of an accident in Chicago in October 1933 that was not the car's fault. Another driver struck it while they were having a race, and the car turned over, and it was because of this freak accident that the car began to get bad press. Then you go to the archives, and based on his correspondence, his notes, press accounts, other versions that I think are very credible, the story is very different. There was no other car involved in the accident in any meaningful way. The Demaxian car started to kind of turn broadside. It rolled by itself, and it's very hard to read the accounts of what happened at the inquest and other sources without concluding that these were design problems. The car was not stable. And although the details of what exactly happened, some of them are unclear. What is clear is that Fuller revised the narrative. He seized on details that were convenient to him, and he embellished others. And so the version of that story you see, even in like very good books about the Demaxian car, is incorrect, and it was fictionalized for a reason. The other example I think about a lot is the Wichita House, which Fuller designed in the late 40s, and which I think is actually a remarkable accomplishment. I think it's a wonderful house that was flawed in some ways. But Fuller always said that, well, I looked at this house and I said, well, this looks fine, but it's just a prototype. We don't have any system in place to distribute or construct it. So I'm going to shut the whole thing down. And he claims he shut the company down, and his investors all lost money, even though there were people lining up to give them capital, to make this house happen. But he said it wasn't ready, and so he consciously just said, we're going to stop the whole thing. That's also not true. If you look at the archives, Fuller resigned from the company over an interpersonal dispute with his other investors, his other partners. He spent a whole year trying to get back in control. And this year disappears from the authorized account of his life. You see in other biographies. It's like a missing year, but it's all there in the archives. And you see the back and forth, you see the scheming, you see the machinations that he did in this very deliberate way to get back in control of this company that he later claimed he shut down on purpose. So again, that story, it sort of furthered this image of Fuller as someone who was a high-minded devotee to pure research and someone who just wanted to explore these designs, and wasn't interested in making money. But you look at the record, and he was incredibly ambitious when it came to realizing these things. He wanted to start companies. He never quite figured out how, but it wasn't for lack of trying. And he kept all the evidence that would undermine that narrative. And I do think about this. I wonder why he kept all this stuff, because, as I said, anyone can go there, and in some ways it's the scale of the archive that I think has discouraged scholars from digging into this stuff in the past. But it's been there since he died. It's been there in some form or other, for decades. And it took a long time for someone to go through and actually go back to those sources and say, okay, so what really happened?
Yeah, I think that it's a perfect time now to to read his words about the guinea pig bee experiment toward the very end of his life. And he wrote, and this touched me deeply, I hope that the record so documented and your hoped for by me close examination of it will serve as an encouragement to you as individuals to undertake tasks that you can see need to be attended to, which are not to the best of your knowledge being attended to by others and for which there are no capital backers. So he was not a great businessman. That's very clear in the archives. He calls that year, by the way, the Black Year. That was the year that the witch and going to bear, trying to get his soul back almost, really,
Right.
because it was such a huge thing. And that's when, as Allegra says, he started to make the models, started to make them very, very rigorously. And that was just prior to starting his, going to all of these universities, working with the students, older students that were out there in the GI Bill, and really getting back into the mix where he had the ability to prototype under the universities. And you cover that so beautifully in your, I just love the way that you're able to weave together thousands of voices. I think it's thousands, it could just be hundreds, but all of the interviews that you did with the contemporaries that are still alive, still living, his colleagues and his family. And but in the letters, you were able to bring all of the direct quotes into the narrative and string them together in the same way that you did with your first biography, which was really about 4 men. And that was one of the things that made me realize that you were the right person and it was the right time. And I'm gonna just do one more quote because I believe this is you. And I guess I sound like an acolyte at this point, but I'm just too close to the material, I guess. Anyway, in his 4D time lock, in one of the visuals for it, he did a sketch of the globe of Earth, and in front of it is a combination lock that's in front of a sand clock, or hourglass, as we call it today. Anyway, in this juxtaposition, he wrote, in which the great combination is revealed, if thoughtfully followed, in the order set down, awaiting the click at each turn. And I know from that he didn't quite know what he was creating, but he knew that it would be unlocked at certain times throughout his life. And so at first he was going back. The earliest stuff is well used, you can tell, but the later stuff, it was just too voluminous. And he just added to it, and continued to add to it until, he had enough staff to actually help him organize it a little bit better. But I want to ask you about your feeling of, was he an ordinary man? Like he continued to say throughout his life, I'm just an ordinary man. Do you think he was ordinary or extraordinary?
I think he was clearly extraordinary. I know where he's coming from, though, when he says he was an ordinary man. He so Fuller, one thing I find very interesting when you go back to his papers is, there are actually very few hints early on that he's going to become the person he does, right? You look at his correspondence from his college years, his early years after his marriage, his first few jobs, and these are very routine letters. They seem very ordinary, and he was privileged. As I put out in the book, his family was not that wealthy, but it was certainly an old family in New England. He was a Harvard student. He didn't graduate, but he was part of this upper class world, and he benefited from that quite a bit. And I think he was given the chance to fail repeatedly, in part because of his class background. And I think he was kind of mediocre in certain ways growing up. He was not a great student. He later claimed to have gotten better grades than he really did in school. And he was told he was, not bright, kind of in a way that I think he never forgot. I think he always felt like an outsider, always felt ostracized, even by his own family. And so all these things kind of come together in his early life. And you could say, yes, look at Fuller before, the age of 32. And it's very hard to say that this person's going to amount to anything that special. But this changes, right? And I think he always points to 1927 as being this turning point, and I accept that. I think something did happen to him that year when he had a crisis/awakening that he famously talked about, by Lake Michigan, which I do think happened. I do think as much as Fuller tends to mythologize his life story, I think something crucial did happen on a particular night in Chicago. And after that, you see him on the one hand remaining very true to his previous self. And so the flaws and the contradictions and the shortcomings you see earlier in his life, they're still there. But at the same time, there's this almost like messianic sense of his mission, of this role he is meant to play, that to me is remarkable. And that confidence in some ways predates his first meaningful innovations. I think he had to believe it himself first and say, I'm the kind of person who can do this, and then stick with that long enough to produce ideas that would become life-changing. And it took a long time. Some of his ideas are kind of fully in place by 1927, 28, but it takes him 20 years to get the dome. And you think about the pace of innovation these days, and how quickly companies are supposed to start up and then go public, and the time scale here is remarkable. The fact that this is a man who was incredibly ambitious, who did not have that huge breakthrough he was looking for until he was basically in his early 50s, to me is incredible. And it took a superhuman amount of self-confidence and these things that are kind of forgotten later on when Fuller is an older man. People that see him for the first time when he's in his 60s or 70s, they have a picture of him that is not entirely accurate, because the young man he had to be in order to grow into that old man is very different from the picture that you have when you see him only at the end. And to me, that's the value of this kind of book and this kind of project, because to me, he only makes sense when you kind of lay out that story from start to finish. I think there have been some really good books about Fuller that I use that I admire very much, but they tend to focus on one piece of that story. And I think the full chronology, that evolution of him as a person, is incredibly revealing.
Yeah, when I met him a number of times, I saw a number of speaking engagements that he was doing in the last 3 years of his life. He was the grandfather. He was the wise man. He had an urgency that most men in their 80s didn't have, and he had a message that he was urgently sharing with us. And we're gonna wrap up and open up to some questions from all of you who have joined today. But I wanted to ask, especially here we are in 2022, and we're facing 3 overlapping existential crises for humanity. He said that we would reach this place and we would not have a lot of time to turn it around. The crises have to do with things he focused on: global warming, which now is the acceleration of climate change, and the pandemic era we just opened the door to again, which may continue, and we're actually seeing it continue. So those 2 things, and finally, we are on the, well, we have a war that's affecting everybody. We are humanity and we have to understand ourselves. So you, as another generation, for me, it was amazing. I felt like I could make a difference. That's what he made you feel like. He didn't have the charisma because, you know, he was hard to understand, but oh, did we feel the urgency of the message? So I have devoted my life since then to these causes. What do you think is the message, especially now that you have the whole story out there, as big of a story as could possibly be written about at this time? What do you think for your generation, his work, his life, what do you think it speaks to the most? And how can that make a difference in the world at this time?
So one thing I want to make very clear is that I think of his life as being incredibly instructive and incredibly useful for people that want to make change. Because he did a lot. You know, he had trouble finishing things, but he was able to start so many things in his life and kind of excite people about so many different ideas in a way that I find really compelling and useful, right? If you're trying to be that kind of person. I think it's only useful when you understand the consequences too, when you see the big picture that I was trying to get at in this book, because the version that Fuller himself conveyed to people was very idealized, and it's kind of the version that has persisted in a lot of books about him that have been previously published. And it doesn't talk about the costs. It doesn't talk about what do you have to sacrifice to become this kind of world-changing figure. And to me, without that information, it's not useful. To me, like the idea that Fuller was just this like benevolent genius who went around the world doing genius things, that doesn't really tell me what to do. It doesn't really give me any information that I can put to use in my own life. But if I tell you that, well, he failed at building a conventional business, and so he ephemeralized himself into this one-man show. He learned how to make things out of little spheres and string and wire that he could make at home. He took that stuff to colleges so he could develop these domes without having to start his own corporation. And he sustained all this by using certain ideas and becoming a certain kind of sort of a figure that I think resembles a startup founder in a lot of ways. That to me is incredibly interesting, because it's like, how did he do it? Right. That was the question I wanted to answer. I think if you look at his, like I say, his evolution as a public figure, he was always trying to find the best way of accomplishing his goals, in a way that led to a lot of mistakes and wrong turns, but which for a long period there he refined into this kind of amazing virtual corporation, this machine that he used to at least get things started. And that to me is like, I don't always agree with his solutions. And I think that his approach also has downsides. I think for among other things, it tends to focus things too much on one person, which is why it had trouble sustaining itself after he died. But that said, if I were like a young, ambitious person with ideas about how to change the world and how to address, some of the crises that you just mentioned, Fuller is an amazing role model. Fuller is an incredible case study. And you would look at his life, look at his successes and his failures and his mistakes and the things he got right. And I can't think of another life in American history that is more instructive when it comes to being that kind of person. As long as you see it as a whole, as long as you understand the downside and the ways in which it diverges from the myth. But my fondest hope, seriously, for this book is that it reaches one or two people who will see it as a manual and see it as a incredible source of tools for accomplishing these kinds of things for real.
Yeah, Bucky himself called that the grand strategy of individual initiative. And that I think that made the devotion of so many of his colleagues so strong. And I knew many of them closely. They were mentors to me in my time. Many of them are no longer here, but he really had this, he grabbed something in each one of the people that they stayed with literally the rest of their lives. And I told you at the very beginning that I've always wanted to see the unsung heroes be laid out and finally talked about, because a lot of these colleagues never really wrote about their own work. And so thank you for that, for your generation. my generation is still here, and we're still devoted to this idea of individual initiative. And the idea that Bucky said at the end of everything was that there will be a time only individual initiative is going to count, and only individual integrity, personal integrity is going to count, each and every one of us, not the leaders, not just, you know, a certain segment of society, but literally everyone. So with that, we have a few minutes for any of you. Is Felicia still here?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Felicia. We have some a little bit of time for question and answer. If you have some questions for Alec about the book, I know we're focusing more on the archives itself, but questions about anything that has been talked about today.
Yeah, if you want to raise your hand or unmute yourself or post your question in the chat. Looks like George has a question. George.
Thanks. Great presentation. I wanted to ask about the systems thinking and the cascading benefits to humanity, because I think that Bucky was really incredible in that scope. And I think too that, you know, we look back at his life, but he's looking at the universe. He's anticipating quantum physics. He's understanding neuroscience. He's seeing where technology is going to take us. And, you know, when you start weaving everything that he brought together, that's what I feel is so inspirational about his work. Because as part of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, I start digging into his material. I'm going, dang, he's got it again, you know? It's so exciting. And this is the time when these solutions have to come off the shelf. So how do we work together to really engage with Bucky's archive and his brilliance, you know, at this critical time?
Well, you know, one thing I like to talk about the evolution of his thinking, which I think might be useful here, is, you know, so he talks about ephemeralization. This is one of his biggest ideas, that you do more with less. And, you know, in his mind, you start with stuff like compression structures like brick or concrete. You move through tension structures like, you know, the Demaxian house and the dome. And then you end up in the visual and the abstract until finally you're doing everything with nothing. Okay. And I think that's a really interesting sequence, but it also describes his career. So he starts out building houses out of these concrete blocks. He moves on to the Demaxian house designs and the domes. But then, you know, he moves into images. He moves into amazing conceptual art. He moves into slides and models that he can carry with him. And finally, he moves into geometry, pure geometry, which eventually becomes synergetics, this, you know, I think incredible trove of axioms and insights into what you call systems theory. And he did it because, you know, he had trouble building houses. He had trouble raising money to, you know, build things. He had to reduce his life to its essentials, at least when it came to, you know, trying to motivate others and to kind of like spread his message. And so you see this amazing sequence where, okay, we can't build these houses. Maybe we'll build a dome that I could construct in a college seminar in 6 weeks. After a while, the domes become less interesting to him. And so he starts to talk more about, you know, he starts to lecture, like the lecture becomes his preferred means of communication. And then finally we get to geometry. We get to ways of thinking about structure. To me, the amazing thing about this is that he had to simplify. He had to do things, you know, using efficient materials because he didn't have a lot of resources. You know, he didn't have millions of dollars to build these things. And so the dome is a structure that he can build out of almost anything: cardboard, wire, you know, plywood. And that is why those ideas become so useful later on to the sciences. So obviously the buckyball, famously, it's a form of carbon that has the structure of a geodesic sphere, and you know, Fuller's ideas were actually key to the scientists who discovered it. You have things like virus structure. You have things like the interior of the cell. You know, these all seem to be following similar rules that Fuller arrived at, and for the same reason, because nature wants simplicity. Nature wants to do more with less. Nature wants to construct and reproduce things as efficiently as possible. So, you know, Fuller discovered how nature builds. And I think this is true. I think this is an amazing part of his legacy, but it happened for practical reasons. He did it because he had no choice, because he had to be simple in order to get things done. And that to me is what I like to bear in mind. It's great to apply these rules in the abstract, and they are fascinating, and I've used them, to like think about things in all kinds of ways. But he arrived at them because there were practical problems he was trying to solve in the real world, and I think that's a key point to bear in mind.
Next question. Again, if you want to raise your hand, post it in the chat or unmute yourself. Well, I have a question.
Go for it.
I'm just curious, I have an orientation towards spirituality and mysticism, and so I'm always kind of glomming onto these little nuggets. I'm very, as I'm new to BFI, I'm also new to Buckminster Fuller's work. I have a much more intact systems thinking background, but specifically, I'm interested in this sort of systems thinking and spirituality and mysticism, and I've picked up these little bits. So I just wonder if you could speak a bit to sort of that, transpersonal or transcendent aspect of Fuller.
Yeah, there's this really interesting convergence in Fuller between the mystic and the technologist, which I try to get at it in the book, and it's really interesting. So on the one hand, Fuller genuinely was someone who was prone to mystical experiences. He talks about, talking to God, and I don't doubt the fact that he felt that he had gone through these transcendent moments in his life that clarified his thinking. At the same time, he also brings out the side of himself at certain points. When he's writing a letter to, Kaiser Aluminum trying to raise money, he's not talking about this stuff. But when he talks to college kids, especially in the 60s and 70s, this becomes much more prominent. And, he's always trying to get things done. And I think he knew how to bring out different aspects of his personality based on the audience he was talking to. And, mystics are, it's a good way to structure a movement. People are drawn to certain kinds of charismatic personalities. And there's a reason why I think, there's this amazing overlap between, the mystic and the startup founder. I think startup founders speak a language that has been compared to the language of cults, in the most negative sense, right? But in a more positive sense, you can say, well, movements that succeed in motivating people tend to take on certain forms. You convince people they're going to change the world. You could go after, younger people who are unattached and willing to sign up, and so Fuller evolves in ways that I think are really instructive. He becomes, there's a side of him that is always mystical, that is much stranger than even people realize based on his visible artifacts. But, he learned how to use that as a tool as well. It became a way for him to motivate people and to kind of keep this big movement that he created organized to some extent when he was not actually there in the room. And so I think a lot of his geometry and his systems theory, it shades into mysticism in this really interesting way. And I'm not saying it's not useful. I'm not saying that invalidates it, but I'm saying that all these things kind of combine to create a message that he knew would be able to sustain the kind of movement that he was trying to build.
Well, it looks like we have a question in the chat, and then it looks like Kurt has a question. So in the chat, Mark asks, did you ask Walter Isaacson if he discussed the Fuller meeting with Jobs?
Well, Walter Isaacson is a very busy man. He, I've not been able to contact him directly, although I hope to reach out to him at some point now that the book's finally out. I did speak to people that knew Jobs. Daniel Kotke, who was Jobs' close friend and who was there at that meeting. People like Jerry Manick, who worked at Apple. People like Norman Foster, who worked on, Apple Park late in life. And the influence of Fuller on Jobs is undeniable. I think it's there. We know circumstantially that he read the whole catalog, that he met Fuller, that he took an interest in Fuller's ideas. Later on, he includes Fuller in the famous Think Different commercial, and that's at Jobs' request. It is hard to pin down exactly what Jobs took from Fuller, but if you see him as being one member of this community in the 70s in California that is designing and building the personal computer, Fuller's influence becomes much more clear. Jobs to me is an amazing anecdote because he is, such an icon in himself, but he is just one example of, I would say, dozens or more people from that period who ended up playing an important role in, the computer revolution, who saw Fuller as a role model, or at least as a source of ideas and metaphors.
Great, thank you. Kurt?
No, hi, thanks you guys, both you. Really appreciate both your comments. And thanks for mentioning the systems change, social change aspect. So when we talk about Bucky, we mention three things usually, right? Trim tab. So, you can be the little rudder on the rudder and change a bigger ship's direction. And then procession, which is, the pollinator, the bee going in the flower and it picks up something it didn't intend to, but it has a positive effect. So it's a systems coupling thing. And then finally, creating a new model, right? That's one of his more famous quotes is don't fight the existing system, create a new model. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on those. Does one resonate to you? Do you connect one of those more strongly with Bucky? Just anything in that area. Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are all great metaphors. I mean, I talk about Fuller as a source of metaphors, and I think he has helped me conceive of my life, in ways that I'm only now starting to realize. To me, the one that I find the most interesting is procession. Procession is movement at right angles, to the force applied, and Fuller uses that as a way of talking about inadvertent side effects. And to him, and to me, this is such a powerful insight because I've seen it in my life. I've seen it in the lives of others and in people I admire, where you start out trying to do one thing and it goes off in a different direction entirely that you could never have expected. And one thing that I think is implicit in the book that I've written is that Fuller structured his life in a way to allow him to take full advantage of procession. So when you're working for a corporation or a government, it's hard to pivot, to use the current term. It's hard to change course when you discover something new. And the thing about Fuller is that, he would do things and discover, kind of unexpected consequences. And because he was this, incredibly ephemeralized one-man show, he could devote attention to that idea almost right away. And so the dome to me is a great example of that, because Fuller is just doing his experiments with geometry, and the dome just kind of emerges from that almost by accident. He's not necessarily seeking the dome when he finds it, but he's working for George Nelson, the famous designer, and he knows he can bring this idea to Nelson, and he can develop it at Black Mountain and the Institute of Design, and do all these things that I think would be impossible if he had had a more conventional career structure. So that to me is a lesson, that I like to apply to my own life, because it is life is random. And I think Fuller was better than almost anyone at identifying and taking advantage of those sources of randomness.
Great. So I apologize, I skipped one question in the chat. The Institute for Aliveness, I think, asked the question, did Bucky speak at all about trauma and our personal responsibility to face the inner world as much as the outer innovation? And then there was also a question about Stuart Brand. And then I'll ask you, Bonnie, if you have any final thoughts before we close.
Well, I mean, Fuller talked about his own trauma at great length, and it's there in his public speeches, and it's there in the archives. Like the death of his daughter, especially, and his failures before he turned 32. And other issues, personal issues. They left his mark. They left their mark on him, and he talks about this very candidly. If you look at some of the very earliest things he wrote, like 40 Time Lock, he says, he never got over some of these things. And it was that sense of failure and that sense of inadequacy that he was able to transform later on. I think he was, as I say, he was privileged in certain ways that made it easier for him to take that trauma and use it, that aren't available to other people who are in similar circumstances. But in terms of someone who did kind of face down that dark night and emerge from it, it is very inspiring, and he, a lot of his flaws also come out of that experience. I think he did become very protective of himself and very transactional in ways that I think are a reflection of those early experiences. But he understood suffering. He understood what it meant to lose something you cared about. And I think that compassion also comes through in a lot of his work.
Well, let's turn to you now, Bonnie, if you have any closing thoughts, and then I will make a few announcements as we finalize this event.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Alec. This is a wonderful window into a very big area of someone's life experience, 88 years of life experience of Buckminster Fuller. I just want to say one comment about the mystical or the inner world and the outer world. Bucky did go through a major explosion. I call it an avalanche of words that came through with the Lightful Housing essay. And I feel that he was, I know this is my personal view, but I feel that he was a bodhisattva. He was a teacher of the last generation, I mean, of the last century. And I think that the power of keeping that mystical connection together throughout his life, and he did talk about this a lot in his later years, and he experienced a lot of profound things that I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that that he did have a deeper connection at one point, even to the point where he was speaking with his eyes closed, with his hands together, almost channeling. I know that's a personal view, but I think it's something that really powered that rigor that kept him going with this experiment. So ending on the idea of the guinea pig bee, B for Bucky, experiment of 56 years, which he talked about a great deal, and really uncovering all of the details of his life that mattered. And that's all in your book. And especially also realize that it's not a small book, it's a very large tome, and there's 126, I think, pages in the endnotes. It is a finding aid of its own, in addition to all the other finding aids. If you ever want to explore the materials themselves, Alec has created a map to that territory, unparalleled, really. Thank you for that, Alec. It's a great contribution to humanity.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. And that was the intention. You know, this is an index, you know, this is a Demaxian index to Fuller's archives. So as big as the book is, there are many, many, many things it does not cover, or it can only cover in passing. So I really hope that it's the beginning of a new wave of Fuller scholarship, that it is helpful to people who are just, you know, going to take it to the next level.
Well, thank you both so much for joining BFI, and to all of our members. If you want to hang out with us in the Welo, which is a little online platform, I'll be in there for a little bit, and anybody who is on this event, I'm going to post the link in the chat now. I've also posted the link in the chat to register for the follow-up Q&A. So those of you whose questions we did not get to, on September 12th, we'll have another event with Alec after you've read the book. And he'll be joined by Lionel Wohlberger to answer your questions. And yeah, I think that is all. You're welcome to unmute if everybody would like to, and we will clap for our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Okay. Thanks a lot.